I was working as a ranger in Olympic National Park for several years, and most of the search calls we responded to followed the same general pattern. A hiker would miss a turn, someone would get separated from their group, or a family member would panic after losing sight of someone on a trail. Usually we found the person within a few hours. Sometimes they were tired or a little shaken, but most of the time they were fine. Every once in a while, though, a call would come in that felt different right away. This one happened on a warm afternoon in early summer. The park was busy that day, especially around a picnic area not far from one of the main trailheads. Families were spread across the clearing, kids running between the trees, while adults set up food and coolers on the tables. It was the kind of day where the forest didn't feel particularly remote. The call came over the radio just after lunch. A family reported that their young son had wandered off while playing with the other kids. At first they assumed he was hiding somewhere nearby, but after about 20 minutes of calling his name and searching the clearing themselves, they couldn't find him anywhere. When I arrived with another ranger, the mood had already changed. The parents were standing near the edge of the clearing where the grass ended and the forest began. A few of the other kids pointed toward the trees and said the boy had run that way while they were playing hide and seek. It wasn't far at all. Maybe 20 or 30 yards from the picnic tables before the trees closed in and the ground started sloping down into thick brush and fallen logs. The first thing we did was a quick sweep of the immediate area. A few of us moved through the tree line calling the boy's name, while others stayed near the clearing in case he came back out on his own. Kids sometimes hide longer than they mean to, especially if they still think it's part of the game. But after 15 minutes of checking just beyond the clearing, we hadn't found anything. No answer to our calls, no movement in the brush, nothing at all. That's when we radioed for additional rangers and began setting up a more organized search. Within an hour, there were teams moving through the surrounding forest in a loose grid. Each group stayed spaced out just enough to keep visual contact while covering ground slowly. Every few minutes, someone would stop, call the boy's name, and then stand still to listen. The woods there are thick, especially once you get a little distance away from the developed parts of the park. Ferns grow waist-high in places, and fallen trees lie across the ground in every direction. It doesn't take much for someone small to disappear into it. What bothered me early on was how little sign there was of where he had gone. Usually when someone pushes through brush, you'll see something. Bent ferns, broken twigs, disturbed leaves, anything that shows the direction they moved. But the forest floor near the clearing looked almost untouched. About an hour into the search, one of the volunteers called out from a small slope just downhill from the picnic area. When we reached him, he was pointing at something beside a fallen log. It was a small sneaker. The parents confirmed immediately that it belonged to their son. The strange thing was that it didn't look like it had come off while he was running. It was sitting upright beside the log, almost like it had been set there. We searched the ground around it carefully, hoping to find footprints or some other clue that would tell us which direction he had gone. But again, there was almost nothing. Just dry leaves and moss that hadn't been disturbed enough to leave a clear track. The search expanded from there. More rangers arrived, along with volunteers and a tracking team. Radios kept crackling as people checked in from different parts of the forest. Late in the afternoon, one of the searchers radioed that he thought he had heard someone calling from further uphill. He couldn't make out any words, but he said it sounded like a child's voice, Several of us moved in that direction as quickly as we could through the trees, calling out the boy's name every few seconds. But when we reached the area, the woods were completely quiet. We stood there listening for several minutes, hoping to hear the voice again. But the only sound was the wind moving through the branches. The search continued well into the night and then again the next day. Helicopters worked the valleys while teams of rangers and volunteers combed through miles of surrounding forest. Every trail, creek, and slope near that picnic area was searched more than once. But despite all of that effort, the only clear sign we ever found of where the boy had been was that single shoe beside the fallen log. In search and rescue, you learn pretty quickly that the wilderness can hide things surprisingly well. People get turned around, slip into difficult terrain, or wander farther than anyone expects. Most of the time, eventually the pieces of the story come together. But that one never did. Even now, years later, I still think about how a child could run 30 yards into the trees on a busy summer afternoon and disappear inside one of the most visited parks in the country without leaving behind anything except a single shoe on the forest floor. The first thing I noticed at the trail register was that someone had signed in using my name. I was halfway through a loop on the north side of the park, checking a stretch of trail that stayed quiet even in summer, and I stopped at the register box mostly out of habit. We'd get hikers now and then, but not enough to fill many pages. That morning there were only 3 entries. A couple from Spokane, a solo backpacker, and then my full name written in block letters with the time marked as 6:10 a.m., almost 2 hours before I'd even started my shift. At first I figured it was a joke from one of the seasonal guys. We all knew each other's routes, and people messed around sometimes, especially if they knew you'd be stuck alone for the day. But when I looked closer, there was more than just my name. In the notes section, where people usually wrote their destination, whoever had filled it out had written, "Same route as usual." That wasn't something a visitor would know, and it wasn't the kind of detail my coworkers would bother with either. I radioed in and asked if anyone had been out ahead of me near Lost Mule Ridge. Dispatch said no. I asked if one of the guys had come through before shift change and signed the register as a prank. Nobody had. The woman at the desk laughed a little at first, then stopped when I read the note to her. She told me to take a photo of the page and keep moving, since I still had 6 miles of trail to clear before I circled back. The trail looked normal for the first hour. A few fallen branches, one washed-out section near a creek crossing, some old boot prints and dried mud. I clipped back some brush, checked the campsite spur, and kept heading uphill. Around noon, I reached a rock overlook where I usually stopped for water, and that was where I found the second thing. Someone had stacked 3 flat stones on the bench beside the overlook, and sitting on top was an empty gum wrapper folded into a tight little square that wouldn't have meant much anywhere else. But I'd done that exact thing a few times over the years when I was bored on patrol. Folded my gum wrapper into a square, tucked it under something, then forgotten about it. Just one of those little habits people develop when they spend a lot of time alone. I'd never mentioned it to anyone. I stood there longer than I should have, scanning the ridge and the timber below, trying to spot any movement. I told myself there had to be a normal explanation. Somebody had seen me do it once. Somebody had found an old wrapper and copied it. But after that, the feeling changed. Every place I stopped started to feel watched. I I kept checking behind me even when the trail narrowed and there was nowhere sensible for anyone to walk without me hearing them. The woods were completely still, which made every small sound stand out. About a mile farther on, near a switchback that overlooked a drainage, I found fresh boot prints off the side of the trail. They weren't on the path itself. They were 10 or 15 feet back in the trees, moving parallel to the trail instead of following it. Whoever made them had stopped twice, both times at spots where you could see down onto the trail without being easily seen from below. I crouched down and checked the tread. Not hiking boots, work boots, lug sole, bigger than mine. I called dispatch again and asked if law enforcement could meet me at the lower trailhead instead of the upper one. I tried to keep my voice steady, but she asked right away if I was all right. I told her probably, but I didn't want to exit the way I'd planned. She said the nearest ranger unit was over an hour out, which meant if someone was out there messing with me, I'd be finishing the route alone, whether I liked it or not. The next sign came near an old boundary marker where the trail dipped into thicker timber. There was a fresh blaze cut into a fir tree at shoulder height, and under it someone had nailed a strip of aluminum from an old can. The metal had 2 words scratched into it. On time. That was when the fear actually set in, not because I thought I was in immediate danger, but because it meant somebody had known exactly when I'd reach that point. I left the trail after that and cut down slope through brush to reach an old service road. It was slower and messier, but I wanted out of the timber and onto open ground. The whole way down, I had the feeling I was making a move someone else had already expected. I kept stopping to listen. Once I heard a branch break uphill behind me. Not loud, just enough to tell me I wasn't alone out there. When I reached the road, my truck was still another mile west at the gate. I could see the stretch of gravel through the trees, empty and bright in the afternoon sun. I started walking fast, then jogging, and that was when I noticed something white tucked under my wiper blade from a distance. I knew it was there before I even reached the truck. It sat there too neatly to be random, lifting slightly in the breeze. It was a page torn from an old visitor map, folded in half. Inside, in the same block handwriting from the register, was a list of my regular patrol days for that sector. Monday Ridge Loop, Wednesday Creek Drainage, Friday Upper Camps. All correct. At the bottom was a line with that day's date and a check mark beside my name. The only other thing on the paper was a simple note. That's not how you usually finish. I worked one summer in a fire lookout in eastern Oregon. It was one of those old towers with a single room at the top and stairs all the way down. My job was mostly glassing for smoke, logging weather, and calling in anything unusual. Most days I didn't see anyone at all. The tower sat above a long stretch of burned timber and new growth, and the only way up was a rough service road that maintenance barely touched. Once a week, somebody brought water and supplies if the road was open. Other than that, I was alone. You get used to the wind, the creaking, and the way every little sound carries up there at night. The first thing that bothered me was the door to the cab sticking open when I came back from checking the propane locker. I always pulled it shut because the latch was bad and the wind could swing it. That afternoon there was no wind. I remember standing there with my hand on the knob, trying to remember if I'd left it that way. I told myself I had. A day later, I noticed my binoculars were turned the wrong way on the shelf. I kept them lined up, facing the west windows. because that was where I usually started each scan. It sounds stupid now, but when you spend weeks in one room, you know where things are without thinking. I had the feeling someone had stood where I stood and looked out through the same glass. After that, little things kept stacking up. The cap on my water jug was tightened, much harder than I ever did it. My field notebook, which I kept under the radio, was on top of it when I woke up one morning. One of my canned soups was missing from the shelf, and I almost convinced myself I'd eaten it until I checked the trash and realized I hadn't. None of it was dramatic. That was what made it worse. It felt careful. I started checking the stairs before dark with my flashlight. I'd lean out and look down through the center of the tower to the ground. A couple of times I thought I heard someone on the lower flights after midnight, not climbing exactly, just enough weight on the metal to make it tick. When I called out, it stopped right away. The next afternoon, I took the tower keys and went down to the little equipment shed at the base. The padlock was still on, but the shed door wasn't sitting right in the frame. Inside, nothing major was missing. What got me was the dust on the workbench. Someone had dragged one finger through it in 3 straight lines, like they'd done it slowly while standing there waiting. That was the first time I radioed it in. Dispatch asked if I wanted law enforcement sent up. I said no, and I still think that was because I didn't want to sound stupid. I said it was probably a hiker or a bored kid on an ATV. The nearest deputy was a long way off anyway. They told me to lock up and keep checking in on schedule. That night, I didn't sleep. Around 1 a.m, I heard a sound against the windows, not a knock. More like the soft squeak you get when skin drags on glass. I froze in bed. Then it came again on the south side. The room had windows all around, but beyond them it was black. I turned my lamp off and stayed still. After a minute, I got enough nerve to use the spotlight. I swung it across the south windows and saw nothing outside, but when the beam hit the glass, I could see prints on it from the outside. Not handprints, smears at eye level, like somebody had been standing on the catwalk with their face close to the window trying to look in without reflecting any light. I called dispatch and kept the radio open. While I was talking, I looked over at my logbook on the desk and saw pages bent up near the back. I hadn't touched those pages in days. I flipped to them and found that somebody had pressed hard enough on a missing sheet to leave impressions in the paper below. You could still read parts of it in the indent. It wasn't handwriting I recognized. It was my schedule, written out by day. Morning weather, noon check, evening scan, lights out. Not perfect, but close enough to tell me somebody had been there long enough to learn it. Law enforcement started up the road from town, but they were over an hour out. I locked the trapdoor to the stairs and moved a cabinet over it. Then I heard metal ringing below me. Slow at first, then faster. Someone was coming up. I kept the spotlight aimed down the stairwell opening, and after a few seconds, I saw the top of a hat move through the dark between the flights. Then it stopped. Whoever it was stayed just out of sight. I could hear breathing carry up the center of the tower. Not running, not panicked. Just calm breathing, like they knew I had nowhere to go. When the deputy finally made it up, they didn't find anyone on the stairs or around the base. They did find a bed laid out in the old lightning shack about 60 yards into the trees, along with empty soup cans, cigarette filters, and pages torn from an old incident map. I was taken off the tower before sunrise. What stuck with me wasn't that someone had been nearby. It was how patient they were. They hadn't rushed me. They hadn't tried to break in right away. They learned my routine first, stood outside my windows at night, and waited until they knew exactly when I'd be alone and tired. The next lookout over that district was staffed again 2 weeks later. The new ranger asked me if the catwalk windows had always had scratches on the outside corners. I told him to ask for a transfer,